Start with one of the most brutal prisons in the world. Sednaya Prison, a symbol of systematic brutality. Sednaya Prison embodies the global failure to protect human rights during Syria's civil war. Located roughly 30 kilometers north of Damascus, Sednaya rose to infamy after 2011 as Syria's uprising morphed into a brutal civil war. Long known as a military prison where political prisoners were sent before the conflict, Sednaya became a central mechanism of repression once peaceful protests were met with violent crackdowns. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have gathered an array of testimonies that paint a grim portrait. Detainees subjected to routine beatings, starvation, psychological torture, and summary executions. Between 2011 and 2015, Amnesty International reported that 5,000 to 13,000 detainees were secretly hanged in weekly executions, compounded by starvation and medical neglect. It's 5,000 lives stolen, 5,000 families torn apart, and 5,000 reminders of humanity's failure. The UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria corroborated similar patterns of abuse, noting that Sednaya functioned as part of a system where detainees, often activists, journalists, opposition supporters, or simply those perceived as disloyal, were degraded to subhuman status. Survivor testimonies provide chilling detail. Prisoners crammed into overcrowded cells, deprived of daylight for months on end, surviving on rancid scraps of food. Interrogations often involved electrocution, forced stress positions, and relentless beatings, intended not just to extract confessions but to break the human spirit. The conditions inside Sednaya were no secret to those running it. Defectors, from guards to military officers, revealed a chillingly organized system of violence at Sednaya Prison. Torture methods were codified, patterns repeated themselves in testimony after testimony. Forced confessions often ended with the victim's death, their bodies disappearing into mass graves. Families of the detained rarely received official death notices. Sometimes, they learned years later that their loved ones had died or simply vanished without a trace. This silence added more pain, hiding the truth from the world. Even basic information, was the person still alive? Had they been transferred, executed? Was withheld, turning uncertainty itself into a psychological weapon. The political backdrop to Sednaya's horror was equally significant. Backed by Russia, Syria's leadership turned the prison into a symbol of its brutal campaign to crush dissent. Diplomatically, attempts to bring perpetrators to justice were repeatedly blocked in the UN Security Council. Russia's veto power stymied referrals to the International Criminal Court, illustrating how geopolitics can shield even the most egregious violations. International condemnation, while vocal, rarely translated into concrete action. Investigations continued, but tangible accountability lagged far behind the mounting evidence. Sednaya's legacy extends well beyond its thick walls. Tens of thousands remain missing throughout Syria's detention network. Some families fled to Europe or North America, bringing their grief and unresolved questions with them. Syrian activists document Sednaya's crimes to preserve evidence and ensure the world cannot claim ignorance, both to preserve evidence for future justice initiatives and to ensure that the world cannot claim ignorance. The Caesar Files, thousands of smuggled photographs of deceased detainees, offered stark visual proof of torture. Courts in Germany and other European countries have begun prosecuting low-level Syrian officials under universal jurisdiction, a cautious but vital step toward some measure of accountability. For those who survived Sednaya, the trauma endures. Many suffer from PTSD, chronic pain, and long-term psychological issues. Their testimonies challenge us to reconsider what we accept as normal in international relations. In understanding Sednaya, we learn that prisons can be far more than detention sites. They can be engines of terror. And once such abuse is allowed to persist, it can metastasize, influencing tactics used in other conflicts. The moral vacuum that enabled Sednaya sets a precedent. If the world could not stop industrial-scale torture and murder there, what faith can victims of other crimes have in the global community's resolve? From torture behind prison walls, we move to another form of cruelty, one that silently chokes entire cities too: starvation warfare, weaponizing hunger. Just as Sednaya's cells confined thousands in darkness, so did sieges isolate entire populations, condemning them to hunger and despair. While bombs and bullets claim immediate attention in armed conflicts, starvation, a slow, invisible weapon, wrought extraordinary suffering in Syria. Starting in 2013, starvation became a weapon in Syria, with sieges like Eastern Ghouta condemning 400,000 civilians to unimaginable suffering. By 2017, UN data indicated that approximately 1.9 million people across Syria were trapped in besieged or hard-to-reach areas, severely restricting humanitarian aid deliveries. Prices for staples skyrocketed. During the peak of the Madaya siege in 2016, a kilo of rice reportedly sold for as much as $250 on the black market, illustrating extreme price inflation under blockade conditions. Families resorted to eating leaves, grass, and spoiled grains. Malnutrition soared, and children in particular suffered irreversible developmental damage. But Eastern Ghouta wasn't alone. Places like Yarmouk, Madaya, and Daraya also faced crippling blockades. The logic behind these tactics is chillingly straightforward. Deprive communities of sustenance until they surrender or perish. Unlike a frontline battle, starvation warfare unfolds quietly. Journalists struggled to get access. International aid groups had their convoys turned back at checkpoints. Humanitarian pleas often fell on deaf ears, as warring parties used hunger as a bargaining chip. The UN occasionally brokered limited aid deliveries, but these were often sporadic and insufficient. By the time a siege ended, whether through a deal, a forced displacement, or a military takeover, thousands might have died needlessly, not from bullets, but from empty stomachs. International law is unequivocal. Intentionally using starvation as a method of warfare against civilians is a war crime. Yet accountability proved elusive. With Russia and other powers blocking or watering down resolutions at the UN, meaningful enforcement of international norms faltered. Siege Watch, an initiative by PAX and the Syria Institute, meticulously documented the extent of sieges, the number of people affected, and the humanitarian conditions on the ground. They provided interactive maps, eyewitness accounts, and monthly updates to ensure the world could not claim ignorance. The aftermath of starvation warfare is not just about death tolls. Survivors carry scars that go beyond the physical. Chronic malnutrition can impair cognitive function in children, affecting their future learning and earning capacity. Parents who watch their children waste away experience profound guilt and trauma. Entire communities emerge psychologically shattered, mistrustful of any promises from the international community. Diplomatic condemnations, while frequent, rarely translated into urgent action. This inaction frayed confidence in global humanitarian principles and contributed to a cynical view. If these blatant war crimes could go largely unpunished, what hope was there for preventing future atrocities? As global attention pivots between conflicts, Syria, Ukraine, Yemen, there are haunting parallels. The logistical blockade of resources, whether food or fuel, can force populations into submission without a single bomb dropping. Syria's experience offers a grim case study, one that policy analysts, humanitarians, and diplomats frequently cite when urging swifter international responses elsewhere. From a geopolitical perspective, Russia's military involvement in Syria after 2015 added complexity. Russian air support helped the Syrian government recapture besieged territories, but this often came after prolonged starvation campaigns. Observers argue that, by failing to denounce or halt these tactics, international actors indirectly normalized them. Meanwhile, media coverage tended to spike during certain high-profile incidents. Images of skeletal children occasionally graced global news, but soon attention drifted, overshadowed by breaking stories elsewhere. For Syrians who lived through these sieges, the scars remain. Some now reside in refugee camps, struggling to rebuild lives in countries like Turkey, Lebanon, or Germany. Others are internally displaced, living in areas that, while no longer under siege, still lack consistent access to healthcare, education, or employment. The legacy of hunger also affects reconciliation efforts. How do you rebuild trust in a government or armed group that starved your community into submission? Starvation warfare in Syria thus stands as a stark reminder that atrocities come in many forms. They need not be loud or spectacular to devastate. As we turn our gaze to another morally catastrophic practice, the use of chemical weapons, we should recognize that, as with Sednaya prison and starvation sieges, the world's reaction will define future lines that cannot be crossed. Or, if we fail again, lines that no longer hold any meaning. 3. Chemical weapons in Syria, breaking global taboos. In modern warfare, certain weapons are universally abhorred. Chemical agents fall squarely in this category, prohibited by treaties like the Chemical Weapons Convention and associated with unspeakable horrors dating back to World War I. Yet in Syria, these red lines were crossed multiple times. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in August 2013, when rockets loaded with sarin gas struck the Ghouta region, killing hundreds. Medical NGOs treating victims noted that over 3,600 people exhibited neurotoxic symptoms following that single attack. Scenes of lifeless children and adults convulsing, struggling for breath, circulated globally, provoking outrage and calls for immediate action. Despite these calls, firm accountability proved elusive. Under intense international pressure, the Syrian government agreed to dismantle its chemical stockpiles in a 2013 deal mediated by Russia and the United States. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, oversaw the removal of declared chemical arsenals, yet attacks persisted. Reports emerged of chlorine barrel bombs dropped on civilian areas, causing panic and respiratory agony among survivors. The OPCW-UN Joint Investigative Mechanism confirmed various instances of chemical attacks by the Syrian government and, in some cases, non-state actors like ISIS. Between 2014 and 2017, the OPCW attributed at least 33 chemical attacks to Syrian government forces, establishing a recurring pattern of prohibited weapon use. Why didn't the global chorus of condemnation lead to a more decisive response? Part of the answer lies in geopolitical deadlock. Russia, a key ally of the Syrian government, repeatedly used its UN Security Council veto to block resolutions that might have penalized Damascus. Without a united front, international law lost its teeth. Credible investigations by UN-mandated panels and human rights organizations produced detailed reports attributing attacks, but absent an enforceable international judiciary mechanism, perpetrators calculated that the diplomatic costs were manageable. The psychological impact of chemical attacks extends beyond immediate casualties. They instill terror. Unlike conventional bombs, chemical agents are silent, invisible killers. Survivors describe fear gripping entire communities. Any whiff of chlorine in the air could spark panic. Medical workers, already overwhelmed, struggled to treat victims without proper protective gear. These atrocities not only kill, they unravel the social fabric, fueling displacement as people flee areas targeted by chemical agents. According to various humanitarian organizations, repeated chemical incidents contributed to the mass exodus of Syrians, pushing millions into refugee camps abroad. For the international community, the Syrian chemical weapons crisis was a colossal moral failure. Leaders had declared chemical use a red line, but enforcement faltered. This gap emboldened other actors worldwide to test the boundaries of international norms. Observers warn that the relative impunity in Syria could inspire other regimes or extremist groups to consider chemical attacks as an option should they find themselves cornered. While efforts to document these crimes persist, genuine accountability remains piecemeal. Some individual perpetrators may eventually face trial in countries applying universal jurisdiction. Yet broader justice mechanisms akin to a dedicated tribunal have not materialized. The lack of precedent raises urgent questions. If something as universally condemned as chemical warfare can go largely unpunished, what does that say about humanity's moral order? The echoes of these attacks still reverberate. Medical studies among survivors indicate long-term health consequences, including chronic respiratory issues and neurological damage. Families grapple with lingering trauma. International trust erodes as global powers appear powerless or unwilling to uphold the rules they helped establish. Civilians trapped in other conflict zones watch and learn. The so-called international community might promise protection, but when push comes to shove, those promises can prove hollow. As we proceed, we'll examine yet another dimension of Syria's tragedy that left tens of thousands in limbo and their families in a perpetual state of dread. If the use of chemical weapons showed us how even the brightest red lines can fade, these reveal how cruelty can persist in silence, far from the lens of any camera or the ear of any reporter. 4. Enforced disappearances, a nation of the missing. Few atrocities are as psychologically corrosive as enforced disappearances. Unlike visible crimes, bombed hospitals, or chemical attacks, disappearances operate in the shadows. By 2020, the Syrian Network for Human Rights documented at least 99,479 individuals forcibly disappeared, underscoring the staggering scale of this crisis. Some were journalists, activists, or suspected dissidents. Others were ordinary citizens caught at the wrong place or targeted by association. Their fate, unknown. Every forced disappearance in Syria is a weapon of silence, used to dismantle families and communities piece by piece. A husband leaves for work and never returns. A teenager is taken at a checkpoint. Parents spend years searching prisons, bribing officials, posting on social media, and contacting NGOs in the desperate hope of news. Without official confirmation of death, they cannot mourn. Without proof of life, they cannot hope. This suspended agony is itself a form of psychological warfare. It fractures communities, breaks social trust, and drains family resources as they chase rumors and pay middlemen for false leads. The UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances repeatedly requested information from the Syrian government and other actors, usually receiving silence. Credible eyewitness accounts described clandestine prisons scattered across the country. Some detainees might have ended up in places like Sednaya. Others were shipped to unknown facilities, possibly tortured or killed. Politically, enforced disappearances serve multiple purposes. They send a warning, step out of line, and you too could vanish. They also erase evidence of other crimes. A disappeared person can't testify about torture, starvation tactics, or chemical attacks. From the regime's perspective, the veil of silence protects perpetrators from scrutiny. From the viewpoint of opposition groups who also disappeared captives, it's a brutal tactic to sow fear and maintain control. International responses have been tepid. Although the issue of Syria's disappeared surfaces in UN reports and human rights resolutions, concrete enforcement mechanisms are lacking. Russia's veto power in the Security Council once again prevents any unified international legal action. The societal cost is enormous. How can a society move forward without knowing the fate of thousands? Disappearances devastate family structures and weaken any future attempts at reconciliation. Syrians in exile form advocacy groups, hoping to keep this issue alive on the international agenda. They gather testimonies, preserve documents, and push for the creation of an international mechanism to locate the missing. Amid ongoing conflicts elsewhere, Ukraine's war, for instance, observers highlight the Syrian precedent. If tens of thousands can vanish with impunity, what's to stop this from becoming a common tool of repression worldwide? The potential normalization of enforced disappearance threatens the post-World War II human rights framework, which was built on the notion that certain crimes should never be tolerated. For victims' families, time drags on. In a 2019 survey of 300 Syrian refugee families in Lebanon, over 45% reported having at least one close relative forcibly disappeared, reflecting the widespread human toll. Every passing day without word is another wound. Mental health experts note that ambiguous loss, where a loved one's fate is uncertain, can be even more traumatic than confirmed death. Closure is impossible. Grief is suspended, turning into chronic torment. This emotional toll can span generations, affecting children who grow up without grandparents or siblings, whose entire worldview is shaped by fear and unanswered questions. As we leave the silent realm of enforced disappearances, we turn to another form of horror story. If vanishings expose the fragility of human rights in darkness, the deliberate destruction of medical facilities shatters the illusion of sanctuary, turning places of healing into theaters of war, where no boundary is sacred and no life is spared. 5. Targeting healthcare, when healers become targets. Warfare is inherently destructive, but throughout history, a handful of principles have aimed to preserve a modicum of humanity amid chaos. One such principle is the protection of medical personnel and facilities. The idea that doctors, nurses, and paramedics, and the hospitals in which they work should remain off limits has been enshrined in international law for generations. Yet in Syria, this principle was frequently discarded. Over 900 medical workers were killed, transforming hospitals into battlefields of despair. In 2016 alone, the organization recorded 198 such attacks, making it the most violent year for healthcare providers during the conflict. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern. Hospitals were bombed, ambulances shelled, and healthcare workers intimidated or arrested. A 2019 World Health Organization assessment found that over 50% of Syria's healthcare infrastructure had been damaged or destroyed, drastically reducing access to essential medical services. In some cases, snipers targeted those attempting to rescue the wounded. Doctors had to operate in underground clinics, sometimes without anesthesia or basic surgical tools. Electricity and clean water were luxuries. In besieged areas, medical staff risked their lives not only to treat patients, but also to keep their location secret. Publicizing a hospital's coordinates to secure international aid sometimes led to that very hospital being bombed. Why target healthcare? One reason: removing medical care breaks the resilience of a community. Without a functioning hospital, treatable injuries become fatal. Women die in childbirth due to lack of proper care. Survivors of conventional or chemical attacks cannot recover, draining morale and pushing civilians to flee. The annihilation of healthcare thus becomes a strategic goal, forcing surrender without necessarily firing on combatants alone. The collapse of medical neutrality also spreads terror. If even a hospital is not safe, where can anyone find refuge? By eroding trust in healthcare, these attacks paralyze communities and prolong suffering. International law clearly classifies intentional attacks on medical facilities as war crimes. Yet, concrete steps to end them or hold perpetrators accountable remained minimal. Some reports implicated Syrian government forces and their allies, including Russia, in strikes on healthcare facilities. Russia consistently denied deliberate targeting, but independent investigations by groups like Air Wars and the Syrian Archive raised serious doubts, citing coordinates, time logs, and munitions analysis. The legacy of these attacks will haunt Syria for decades. Entire generations of medical professionals have fled, leading to a brain drain that hampers any post-war recovery. By 2020, an estimated 70% of Syria's medical professionals had fled the country, according to diaspora data, compounding the severe shortage of qualified healthcare providers. Patients with chronic illnesses lacked proper treatment for years, exacerbating long-term health crises. Psychological trauma extends to both patients and doctors. Witnessing the bombing of a hospital or the execution of a colleague leaves deep scars that do not fade with a peace treaty. From a global perspective, Syria's pattern of attacking healthcare sets a dangerous precedent. If these acts go largely unpunished, other regimes or factions might follow suit. Conflicts in other parts of the world could mimic such tactics, eroding one of the last vestiges of decency in war. The crumbling of healthcare protections in Syria underlines how fragile our humanitarian standards are when confronted with indifference and geopolitical stalemates. As the war in Syria ebbed in certain areas, the damage remained. Rebuilding hospitals, retraining medical staff, and restoring trust will be daunting. International donors face the challenge of not just reconstructing buildings, but also addressing the psychological harm done to communities too frightened to seek medical help. Many Syrian doctors who now reside abroad are uncertain if they'll ever return. The intangible cost, a loss of professional talent and institutional knowledge, further undermines Syria's potential to recover. It can shape how we respond to current and future conflicts, whether they unfold in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, or anywhere else, reminding us that turning away from suffering only paves the way for more atrocities. Each atrocity forms part of a chilling pattern, a system where cruelty thrives in silence. In each case, the world's response was fragmented, often stymied by political interests. Now, as we step back for a final reflection, we must ask what these lessons mean for the future of international law, global governance, and our shared humanity. Our goal is not to sensationalize, but to understand, to piece together credible data, survivor testimonies, and investigative reports. The Syrian conflict's darkest chapters defy simple explanations and easy fixes. Sednaya prison revealed how institutions can become engines of terror. Starvation warfare showed how hunger itself can be weaponized. Chemical attacks demonstrated that even universal taboos can be breached with impunity. Enforced disappearances and assaults on healthcare workers prove that silence and cruelty can invade every aspect of civil life. What links these atrocities is not just Syria's tragedy, but the world's uncertain and often inadequate response. Diplomatic deadlock, shaped by the vested interests of powerful players like Russia, weakened the effectiveness of international law. The absence of robust accountability mechanisms allowed crimes to continue, tarnishing the credibility of global governance. Syria's tragedy warns us all: when global powers stall, atrocities spread. This isn't just Syria's story, it's a global lesson on the cost of inaction and indifference. If Syria's untold horrors moved you, share this video to raise awareness. Subscribe for more dark history documentaries that reveal the stories the world must never forget. This is Freak Files, channel that bring dark history, horror story to life by documentary. Together, we can turn knowledge into action.